The dust kicked up behind Georgia Mitchell's wagon as she hauled another load of timber across her property, and she didn't notice the stranger watching her from the ridge until his shadow fell across her path. It was late afternoon in June of 1878, and the Arizona Territory sun beat down mercilessly on the land just outside Prescott, turning everything golden and harsh. Georgia pulled her horses to a stop, shielding her eyes against the glare to get a better look at the man who'd interrupted her work. He sat tall in his saddle, a broad-shouldered figure silhouetted against the blazing sky. Even from a distance, she could make out the easy confidence in the way he held himself, like someone who belonged exactly where he was. The stranger tipped his hat to her, and she caught a glimpse of dark hair and a strong jawline before he turned his horse and rode off toward the property that bordered hers to the east. Georgia frowned, clicking her tongue to get her horses moving again. That land had been empty for as long as she'd owned her own spread, nearly 3 years now. Old Mr. Henderson had died without heirs, and the property had sat vacant, slowly going wild. She'd assumed it would stay that way, maybe eventually get claimed by squatters or sold off in parcels by the territorial government. The thought of having a neighbor after all this time felt strange, almost intrusive. She'd come to Arizona Territory after her father died back in Missouri, leaving her nothing but debts and disappointed relatives who thought a woman had no business trying to run land on her own. Georgia had sold everything she could, paid what she owed, and headed west with just enough money to buy a small piece of land and start over. At 23 years old, she'd been determined to prove she could make it work. 3 years later, she was still proving it, still fighting for every inch. The next morning, Georgia woke before dawn as usual and went about her chores. She had chickens to feed, horses to tend, and a fence line that needed mending on the western edge of her property. She was carrying a bucket of water from the well when she heard the sound of hammering coming from the direction of Henderson's old place. Curiosity got the better of her around mid-morning. She saddled her mare, Daisy, and rode over to see what was happening. As she crested the small hill that separated the two properties, she stopped short at the sight before her. The stranger from yesterday was there, along with 3 other men, and they were already hard at work. They'd cleared away some of the brush and were in the process of framing up what looked like the beginning of a barn. The stranger had his shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing tanned, muscular forearms as he swung a hammer with practiced precision. He moved with the kind of efficiency that came from years of hard labor, and Georgia found herself watching for a moment longer than she'd intended. He must have sensed her presence because he looked up suddenly, and their eyes met across the distance. Even from where she sat on her horse, she could see his eyes were a striking blue-green color, like the shallow parts of a creek where the sun hits the water just right. He set down his hammer and walked toward her, wiping his hands on his pants. "Morning," he called out as he approached. His voice was deep and warm, with a slight drawl that suggested he was from somewhere south, maybe Texas. "Name's Gabriel Norton. I'm your new neighbor, looks like." Georgia dismounted, more out of politeness than anything else. She was 5'6" in her boots, but he still had a good 6 inches on her. Up close, she could see he was probably around 30, with sun-weathered skin and the kind of face that was more interesting than handsome, full of character and intelligence. "Georgia Mitchell," she said, extending her hand. He shook it firmly, and she appreciated that he didn't adjust his grip like some men did when shaking hands with a woman. "Didn't realize Henderson's land was up for sale." "Wasn't officially," Gabriel said, releasing her hand. "I tracked down a distant cousin of his in California. Took some doing, but we worked out a deal. I've been looking for land in this area for a while now." "Why here?" The question came out more abruptly than she'd intended, but Gabriel didn't seem offended. Good water, decent grazing, close enough to Prescott for supplies but far enough out for privacy. He gestured at the land around them. Plus, I heard the neighbors were quiet. Was that a joke? Georgia studied his face and caught the slightest hint of humor in his eyes. Despite herself, she felt the corner of her mouth twitch. I'm plenty quiet so long as nobody gives me reason not to be, she said. Fair enough. Gabriel crossed his arms over his chest, and she noticed the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders. What do you raise? Cattle, horses? Horses mostly. Some cattle, chickens, a big garden. I do some breaking and training for folks in town. Whatever keeps food on the table and the bank satisfied. She wasn't sure why she was telling him all this. Maybe because he was actually listening, his attention focused on her in a way that felt genuine rather than patronizing. What about you? Cattle primarily. I've got a small herd coming up from Texas in a few weeks. Until then, I'm focused on getting the barn up and a decent house built. He looked back at his work crew, then at Georgia again. If you ever need a hand with anything, let me know. That's what neighbors are for. Georgia nodded, though she had no intention of asking for help. She'd made it this far on her own, and she wasn't about to start depending on someone just because he happened to be friendly. Same to you, she said, more out of courtesy than sincerity. As she rode back to her property, Georgia couldn't shake the feeling that something about this was off. Prescott wasn't exactly a secret, but it wasn't the most obvious choice for someone coming from Texas either. There was plenty of land available in other parts of the territory, places with easier access to railroads or larger markets. Why go to all the trouble of tracking down Henderson's heir just to buy this particular piece of land? She pushed the thought aside as she got back to work. It didn't matter why Gabriel Norton had bought the land next to hers. What mattered was keeping her own operation running, which meant she had fences to mend and horses to train. Over the next few weeks, Georgia became accustomed to the sounds of construction drifting over from Gabriel's property. The barn went up quickly, solid and well built. She saw him in town occasionally, loading supplies onto his wagon or talking with the local lumber merchant. He always tipped his hat to her, sometimes stopped to exchange a few words about the weather or to ask if she'd heard anything about a good source for buying tack. Their conversations were brief and pleasant, nothing more. Then one evening in late July, Georgia heard a commotion from Gabriel's land just as the sun was setting. It sounded like cattle, a lot of them, and men shouting. His herd must have arrived. She walked out to the edge of her property and watched as dozens of longhorns were guided into the newly finished pens. Gabriel was on horseback, working alongside his men to get the animals settled. Even in the fading light, she could see this was a good-sized operation, bigger than she'd expected. The next morning, Gabriel showed up at her door just after sunrise. Georgia had been in the middle of making coffee, still in her work clothes from the early chores, her dark blonde hair pulled back in a simple braid. "Morning," Gabriel said when she opened the door. He held his hat in his hands, looking oddly formal. "Sorry to bother you so early, but I wanted to let you know we got our cattle in last night. If any of them break through and end up on your land, just send word and we'll come get them." "Appreciate that," Georgia said. She studied him for a moment, noting the tired lines around his eyes. "Long night, you could say that. Lost count of how many times I had to circle around and bring back strays." He ran a hand through his hair, making it stick up at odd angles. "Worth it, though. Been building toward this for a long time." Something in his voice made Georgia curious despite herself. "You were ranching in Texas before." "Working ranches, yeah, but never owned one. That was always the dream, though. Save up enough to buy my own land, build something that would last." He looked out at the horizon, his expression distant. My father was a ranch hand his whole life. Good man, hard worker, but he never owned anything. I wanted different. Georgia understood that sentiment more than she wanted to admit. Well, you've got a good start here. Thanks. Gabriel's attention returned to her, and there was something in his gaze that made her suddenly aware of how close they were standing, how the morning light caught in his eyes. What about you? You mentioned Missouri when we first met. What brought you out here? Same as you, I suppose. Wanted something of my own. She didn't elaborate and he didn't push, which she appreciated. If you're not too tired, I just made coffee. The offer surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. Gabriel's face lit up with a genuine smile that transformed his features, making him look younger and more approachable. I'd like that very much, he said. They sat on George's small porch, drinking coffee and watching the sun climb higher. The conversation flowed easier than Georgia expected. Gabriel told her about growing up in Texas, about the years he'd spent working different ranches and learning everything he could about raising cattle. He talked about his mother, who'd died when he was young, and his father, who'd passed 2 years ago. It was his father's death that had finally pushed Gabriel to pursue his own dream rather than waiting for the perfect moment. Georgia found herself sharing more than she usually did, telling him about her father's debts and the relatives who'd written her off as foolish for heading west alone. She talked about the struggles of that first year, when she'd nearly lost everything to a late spring freeze that killed half her garden, and a bout of illness that swept through her small herd. But you made it through, Gabriel said, and there was admiration in his voice that made George's chest tighten. Barely. There were times I thought about giving up, heading back east and admitting defeat. She took a sip of her coffee, now lukewarm. Stubbornness is probably my worst and best quality. I don't know about worst, Gabriel said. Seems to me stubbornness is just determination by another name. They talked until the sun was fully up, and Gabriel finally stood to leave, saying he needed to check on the herd and make sure everyone had settled in properly. As Georgia watched him ride back to his property, she realized she'd enjoyed his company more than she'd enjoyed anyone's in a long time. The thought made her uneasy. She'd worked hard to build her independence, and she wasn't looking for complications. Over the following weeks, Gabriel became a regular presence at George's place and she at his. It started innocently enough. He'd stop by to borrow a tool or to let her know about a problem with the shared fence line. She'd ride over to return something or to warn him about a pack of coyotes she'd spotted. Gradually, these brief visits stretched longer. They'd end up talking while mending fence together, or she'd help him doctor a sick calf, or he'd give her a hand moving hay bales. Georgia told herself it was just neighborly cooperation, but she couldn't ignore the way her heart sped up when she saw him riding toward her place, or how she'd started taking a bit more care with her appearance in the mornings, just in case he stopped by. It was mid-August when things shifted. Georgia's prize stallion, Thunder, had gotten tangled in some old barbed wire at the far edge of her property. She'd found him in the early morning, scared and bleeding, and she'd spent nearly an hour carefully cutting him free and calming him down enough to lead him back to the barn. The cuts weren't life-threatening, but they needed proper cleaning and bandaging, and Thunder was spooked enough that he wasn't cooperating. Gabriel must have seen her struggling because he appeared in the barn doorway just as Thunder reared up for the third time, nearly yanking the lead rope from George's hands. "Need help?" Gabriel asked calmly, not moving too quickly or making sudden gestures that might spook the horse further. George's pride wanted to say no, but her practicality won out. "He needs these wounds cleaned, but he won't hold still." Gabriel approached slowly, talking in a low, soothing voice. He had a way with animals Georgia had noticed before. Something about his calm presence seemed to settle them. Thunder's eyes were still rolling, but he stopped fighting as Gabriel got closer. "Easy there, big fellow," Gabriel murmured, reaching out to stroke Thunder's neck. "Nobody's going to hurt you. We're just trying to help." Together, they managed to clean and bandage Thunder's wounds. Gabriel held the horse steady while Georgia worked, his hands firm but gentle on the lead rope. When it was done, Thunder was calm enough to eat some oats from Gabriel's hand. "How'd you learn to do that?" Georgia asked, washing her hands in the bucket of water by the barn door. "My father. He always said animals can sense what you're feeling. If you're calm, they'll be calm. If you're anxious, they'll pick up on it." Gabriel gave Thunder one last pat before stepping back. "Looks like he'll be fine. Those cuts should heal up clean if you keep them covered for a few days." "Thank you." Georgia meant it sincerely. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't shown up. You'd have figured it out. You always do." Gabriel leaned against the barn wall, his eyes on her rather than the horse. "You're about the most capable person I've ever met, Georgia Mitchell." The compliment, delivered so straightforwardly, made Georgia's cheeks warm. She busied herself putting away the medical supplies, trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach. "I just do what needs doing. That's exactly what I mean." Gabriel pushed away from the wall, moving closer. "Most people see a problem and look for someone else to solve it. You see a problem and solve it yourself. It's impressive." Georgia looked up at him, and suddenly the barn felt very small. She was acutely aware of how close he was standing, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his blue-green eyes, close enough to smell the mixture of leather and sage that seemed to cling to him. "I should get back," Gabriel said, but he didn't move. "Got a fence section that needs work." "Right," Georgia said, "and I need to check on the chickens." They stood there for another moment, neither moving, and Georgia felt something pass between them, an acknowledgement of feelings neither was quite ready to name. Then Gabriel stepped back, breaking the spell. "I'll check on Thunder tomorrow if that's all right," he said. "That would be good," Georgia managed to say. After he left, Georgia sat down on a hay bale and pressed her hands to her warm cheeks. This was getting complicated, and she didn't know what to do about it. Part of her wanted to keep her distance, to protect the independence she'd fought so hard for. But another part, a part that was growing stronger every day, wanted to see where this might lead. Gabriel did come by the next day to check on Thunder, and the day after that, and the day after that. Each visit lasted a little longer. They'd start out discussing the horse's progress, then somehow end up talking about everything else. Georgia learned that Gabriel had a younger sister in Texas who was happily married with 2 children. He learned that Georgia's mother had died when she was young, just like his, and that she still missed her terribly. They discovered they both loved watching thunderstorms and hated the taste of liver, no matter how it was prepared. They argued good-naturedly about the best way to break a horse and whether coffee should be drunk black or with sugar. One evening in early September, Gabriel invited Georgia to dinner. He'd been practicing his cooking, he said, and needed someone to tell him honestly if his stew was edible or if he should stick to simple beans and bacon. Georgia accepted, telling herself it was just a neighborly dinner, nothing more. She wore her nicer dress, the dark blue one that her friend in town had said brought out her eyes, but only because her work clothes needed washing. She braided her hair more carefully than usual, but only because she'd had extra time. The fact that her hands trembled slightly as she knocked on Gabriel's door had nothing to do with anything. Gabriel opened the door, and Georgia's breath caught. He'd cleaned up too, wearing a pressed shirt she'd never seen before, his dark hair still damp from washing. The house behind him was simple but tidy, furnished with handmade pieces that showed careful craftsmanship. "Come in," Gabriel said, stepping aside. "I hope you're hungry. I might have made too much." The stew was actually quite good, seasoned well and full of tender beef and vegetables. They ate at Gabriel's small table, talking and laughing as the sun set outside. Gabriel told her about the time he tried to impress a girl back in Texas by riding a particularly wild bronco and had ended up in the town fountain instead. Georgia shared the story of her first attempt at making bread, which had come out so hard it could have been used as a weapon. After dinner, they sat on Gabriel's porch, watching the stars come out. The night was cooler than it had been, a hint of fall in the air. Georgia wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders, and Gabriel shifted closer, as if to block the breeze. "Can I ask you something?" Gabriel said after a comfortable silence, "Sure." "Do you ever get lonely out here?" His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "I know you're independent and I admire that, but everyone needs someone." Georgia considered the question carefully. A few months ago, she would have said no without hesitation. She'd been content with her solitude, proud of making it on her own. But now, sitting here with Gabriel, she realized something had changed. "I used to think being alone and being lonely were the same thing," she said slowly. "I thought if I could just prove I didn't need anyone, then I'd be happy. But lately, I've realized there's a difference between not needing someone and not wanting someone in your life." Gabriel turned to look at her, and even in the starlight, she could see the intensity in his eyes. "And what do you want, Georgia?" It was a bold question, one that demanded an honest answer. Georgia's heart pounded as she met his gaze. "I'm not sure yet. This is all new to me. I've spent so long focused on just surviving that I haven't let myself think about much else." "I understand that." Gabriel reached over and took her hand, his fingers warm and calloused against hers. "Can I tell you what I want?" Georgia nodded, not trusting her voice. "I want to build something lasting here. Not just a ranch, but a life. A real life with someone to share it with." He paused, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "When I first heard about the land next to yours being available, I thought it was just good fortune. Good water, good grazing. But then I met you, and I started to think maybe it was more than that." "What do you mean, when you first heard about it?" Georgia's mind caught on that phrase. "I thought you said you'd been looking for land in this area." Gabriel had the grace to look sheepish. "I might not have been entirely forthcoming about that. Truth is, I heard about you before I heard about the land." Georgia pulled her hand back, confusion and something like anger rising in her chest. "What are you talking about? Last spring, I was in Prescott looking at properties. Not seriously, but just seeing what was available. I stopped in at the saloon for a drink, and I overheard some men talking. They were discussing whether they should try to court the woman rancher who lived outside of town, but they were saying awful things, talking about you like you were just a challenge to be won." Gabriel's jaw tightened at the memory. "One of them said your name, Georgia Mitchell, and they were laughing about how you'd turned down everyone who tried. Then one mentioned the property next to yours might be available, and they were betting on who'd get it first and who'd wear you down." Georgia felt her face flush, a mixture of embarrassment and fury. "So you decided to buy the land yourself. To what, protect me? I don't need protecting, Gabriel. That's not why, or not the only reason." Gabriel stood up, pacing the length of the porch. "Yes, I didn't like hearing them talk about you that way, and yes, I thought if someone was going to be your neighbor, it should be someone decent. But then I asked around town about you discreetly. Everyone I talked to said the same things, that you were tough, smart, independent. That you'd built something out here against all odds, that you were kind but didn't suffer fools. And I thought, that's the kind of person I'd like to know. The kind of person I'd like to build a life near, even if we only ever ended up being friends." But you didn't tell me any of this." Georgia stood as well, needing to move to process what she was hearing. "All this time I thought it was just coincidence, just luck that brought you here, but you sought this out. You sought me out. I should have told you sooner, I know that." Gabriel stopped pacing, turning to face her directly. "At first, I didn't know how. How do you tell someone that you bought land next to theirs because you admired them before you'd even met? It sounded strange even to me. And then as we got to know each other, I kept meaning to bring it up, but the right moment never seemed to come. I'm sorry, Georgia. I should have been honest from the start." Georgia stood at the edge of his porch, looking out at the dark landscape. Her mind was spinning. Part of her was angry that Gabriel hadn't been truthful. But another part, a part she was almost afraid to acknowledge, was touched that he'd thought so highly of her before they'd even met, that he'd gone to such lengths to be near her. "Those men in the saloon," she said finally. "Do you remember who they were? The Hendricks brothers and a couple of their friends." "Why?" Georgia let out a short, bitter laugh. "Tom Hendricks tried to court me my first year here. When I said no, he spread rumors around town that I was barren, that was why I'd never marry. His brother Jake told everyone I was too masculine, that no real man would want me. It hurt my business for months until people realized I was just as capable regardless of their nonsense." Gabriel moved closer, though he didn't touch her. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that. I'm used to people underestimating me or saying cruel things. What I'm not used to is someone thinking I'm worth all this trouble." She gestured at his house, his land. "You uprooted your whole life and moved here because you heard I was worth knowing." "I moved here because I wanted land of my own. That was always true," Gabriel said. "But yes, where I chose to put down roots, that was because of you. Because I thought if there was even a chance that we might become friends or maybe something more, it would be worth it." Georgia turned to look at him fully. In the moonlight, his face was open and honest, vulnerable in a way she'd rarely seen from anyone, especially a man. He was laying himself bare, risking rejection, and she realized suddenly how much courage that took. "I need time to think about this," she said quietly. "It's a lot to take in, I understand." Gabriel didn't look happy, but he nodded. "Take all the time you need, I'm not going anywhere." Georgia left shortly after, riding home under a canopy of stars. Her mind wouldn't settle. She kept replaying the conversation, examining it from every angle. Gabriel had deceived her, yes, but not maliciously. He'd been drawn to her reputation, to the idea of her, but he'd waited to act on any feelings until he'd actually gotten to know her. He hadn't tried to manipulate or control her. He'd simply wanted to be near her, to have the chance to see if something might develop between them. And something had developed, Georgia admitted to herself as she unsaddled Daisy. Over the past 2 months, Gabriel had become the person she most looked forward to seeing. His opinions mattered to her. His smile made her day brighter. The thought of him not being around made her chest ache. But could she trust him after this revelation? Could she let herself be vulnerable with someone who'd kept such a significant truth from her? Georgia spent a restless night wrestling with these questions. By morning, she was no closer to an answer, but she knew she couldn't avoid Gabriel forever. They were neighbors, and beyond that, she missed him. Even after just one evening apart, she missed talking to him. She was feeding her chickens when she saw Gabriel riding toward her property. Her heart jumped, and she took a moment to compose herself before walking out to meet him. Gabriel dismounted, holding his hat in his hands. He looked like he hadn't slept much either. "Morning. I know you said you needed time, and I'm not here to pressure you. I just wanted to give you this." He held out a folded piece of paper. Georgia took it, curious, and opened it. Inside was a bank document, a deed transfer form. It took her a moment to understand what she was looking at. "This is the deed to your land," she said, confused. Why are you giving this to me? I'm not giving it to you. I'm showing you that I'm willing to. Gabriel met her eyes steadily. If the only way you can trust that I'm not here to control you or take advantage of you is for you to have legal ownership of my land, then I'll sign it over. You could sell it, keep it, do whatever you wanted with it. I'd work for you as a hand if that's what it took to stay near you. Georgia stared at the paper in her hands, then at Gabriel. You're serious. Completely. Georgia, my land, my cattle, everything I've built here, it doesn't mean anything if I've lost your trust. I was an idiot not to tell you the truth from the start, and I'm trying to show you that I know that. He took a step closer. I'm not asking you to marry me or even to forgive me right now. I'm just asking for a chance to prove that I'm here for the right reasons. That I'm here because I think you're remarkable, and if you'll let me, I'd like to spend my life proving that to you. Don't sign that, Georgia said, pushing the paper back toward him. Keep your land, Gabriel. His face fell, and she realized he'd interpreted her words as a rejection. I'm not saying this right, she continued quickly. What I mean is, I don't need you to give up everything to prove yourself to me. Yes, I wish you'd been honest from the start. Yes, it's going to take me a bit to fully wrap my mind around all this. But I also know that what we've built over these past months is real. You didn't buy your way into my life. You worked for it by being a good friend and a good man. Hope flickered in Gabriel's eyes. So you're not sending me away. I'm not sending you away. Georgia felt a smile tugging at her lips despite everything. I'm saying that I'd like to keep getting to know you honestly this time and see where this goes. Can we do that? Yes. Gabriel's whole face lit up. Yes, absolutely. I promise, Georgia, no more secrets. I'll tell you everything, answer any question you have. Good. Then let's start with breakfast. I make terrible coffee, but my biscuits are decent, and you look like you could use some food. They walked back to Georgia's house together, and over breakfast, Gabriel told her everything. He told her about the months he'd spent making inquiries about Henderson's land, the letters he'd written to California, the deal he'd negotiated. He told her about the nervousness he'd felt the first time he'd seen her, worried that the reality wouldn't match the reputation. He told her how relieved he'd been to discover she was even more impressive in person, and how his respect had gradually shifted into something deeper. In turn, Georgia found herself opening up in ways she rarely did. She told him about the loneliness of those first years, about the nights she'd cried herself to sleep wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake coming west. She told him about the small victories that had kept her going, like the first time she'd successfully trained a horse for a buyer, or the first winter she'd made it through without having to dip into her emergency savings. She told him about her dreams for her property, the plans she had to expand if she could ever get ahead financially. What if we helped each other with that? Gabriel suggested. Not me helping you or you helping me, but working together. You've got skills in horse training that I could use, and I've got more hands for heavy labor than I need right now. We could trade work, build both our operations up. Georgia considered it. The old her, the one who'd first arrived in Arizona territory, would have said no out of pride. But she was learning that accepting help wasn't the same as admitting weakness. That could work, she said slowly. As long as it's a fair trade, partners splitting the work and the benefits. Partners, Gabriel agreed, and the word felt significant, full of possibility. Over the following weeks, they fell into a new rhythm. They worked each other's land, combining their knowledge and skills. Gabriel taught Georgia more efficient ways to manage cattle, and she taught him techniques for breaking horses that were gentler and more effective than the harsh methods many cowboys used. They had dinner together several times a week, alternating between houses, and their conversations ranged from practical discussions about ranch management to deeper topics about dreams and fears and everything in between. The people in Prescott noticed the change. When Georgia rode into town, she often saw Gabriel there too, and they'd end up shopping together or having lunch at the small restaurant on Main Street. The gossips had a field day, but Georgia found she didn't care as much as she once would have. Let them talk. She was happy, genuinely happy, in a way she couldn't remember being before. It was October when the first real test of their partnership came. A band of cattle rustlers had been working the area, hitting small ranches that didn't have many hands to guard their herds. Georgia and Gabriel both knew they were potential targets. They decided to combine their herds temporarily, keeping them on Gabriel's land where they could take turns keeping watch at night. The rustlers came on a moonless night in late October. Georgia was on watch, sitting on her horse at the edge of the herd when she heard the sound of approaching riders. There were at least 4 of them, moving quietly, trying to separate some cattle from the main group. Georgia fired her rifle into the air, both as a warning and to alert Gabriel. The rustlers scattered immediately, but not before one of them shot back. The bullet went wide, but it spooked the herd. Suddenly, there were cattle running in every direction, and Georgia was caught in the middle of it. Gabriel appeared within minutes, having heard the shot. He saw Georgia trying to control her spooked horse while avoiding the stampeding cattle. Without hesitation, he rode straight into the chaos, reaching her side and helping to guide her out of danger. Together, they managed to get clear, then worked to calm and gather the scattered herd. It took hours, and by the time the sun came up, they were both exhausted. They'd lost a few cattle, but not as many as they could have. More importantly, neither of them had been seriously hurt. "That was too close," Gabriel said as they finally sat down to rest. His hand was shaking slightly as he poured coffee from the thermos Georgia had brought. "When I saw you in the middle of that stampede, I thought my heart was going to stop." "I'm fine," Georgia assured him, though she was still feeling the adrenaline. "Thanks to you. If you hadn't gotten there so fast." "Don't." Gabriel set down his cup and took her hand. "Don't think about what might have happened. You're safe. That's what matters." Georgia looked at their joined hands, then up at Gabriel's face. He looked haggard, worried, and something else. Something that made her heart race in a different way than the danger had. "Gabriel," she started, not sure what she was going to say. "I love you," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "I know it might be too soon to say it, and I'm not expecting you to say it back. But I nearly lost you tonight, and I realized I can't go another day without you knowing how I feel. I love you, Georgia Mitchell. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you face every challenge head on. I love the way you laugh and the way you're kind to animals and the way you've built this life with your own 2 hands. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you that, if you'll let me." Georgia felt tears prick her eyes. For so long she'd told herself she didn't need anyone, that love was a luxury she couldn't afford. But Gabriel had shown her that love didn't make you weak. It made you stronger. Having someone to lean on, someone who believed in you and supported you, that didn't diminish her independence. It enhanced it. "I love you too," she said, and saying the words out loud felt like coming home. "I think I've loved you for a while now, but I was too scared to admit it. I've been on my own for so long that I forgot what it felt like to have a partner, to have someone who has my back." Gabriel pulled her close, and Georgia went willingly, resting her head against his chest. She could hear his heart beating fast, matching her own. They sat like that for a long moment, holding each other as the sun climbed higher and the normal sounds of morning replaced the chaos of the night. Eventually, they had to move, to finish gathering the cattle and to report the rustling attempt to the sheriff in town. But something fundamental had shifted between them. They'd acknowledged their love, and there was no going back from that. Word of the rustlers spread quickly through Prescott, and several other ranchers organized a group to patrol the area. The rustlers were caught 2 weeks later trying to hit a spread north of town. With that threat handled, life returned to a more peaceful routine, but everything felt different now. Georgia and Gabriel were openly courting, and everyone knew it. November brought cooler weather and the first real frost. Georgia and Gabriel worked together to prepare both properties for winter, making sure all the buildings were sound and that they had enough feed stored for the animals. They fell into an easy domesticity, cooking meals together and spending quiet evenings reading or talking by the fire. It was during one of these quiet evenings, at Gabriel's house in mid-December, that he brought up the topic of the future. "I've been thinking," he said, setting down the book he'd been reading. "We work well together. Both our ranches are doing better now than they were when we were working separately, and I'm happier than I've ever been." "Me too," Georgia said, looking up from the sock she was mending. "So I've been wondering if maybe we should make this arrangement permanent." Gabriel shifted in his chair, suddenly looking nervous in a way Georgia had rarely seen. "Not just the working arrangement, but all of it, us." Georgia's heart started to pound. "What are you saying, Gabriel?" He stood up and crossed to where she was sitting, then did something that made Georgia's breath catch. He got down on one knee, pulling a small box from his pocket. "Georgia Mitchell, you are the strongest, smartest, most incredible person I've ever met. You've made me want to be better, work harder, dream bigger. Before I met you, I thought the ranch was the dream, but now I know the real dream is building a life with you." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band with a small but beautiful diamond. "Will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my everything?" Georgia stared at the ring, then at Gabriel's face. She thought about how her life had changed since he'd ridden onto that property next to hers. How he'd worked his way into her heart with his kindness, his respect, his unwavering support. How he'd never once made her feel less capable or tried to control her. How he'd loved her exactly as she was while also challenging her to be more open, more trusting. "Yes," she said, the word coming easily. "Yes, I'll marry you." Gabriel's face broke into a huge grin, and he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, and Georgia had a moment of wondering how he'd known her size before realizing he must have asked her friend Sarah in town. The thought that he'd planned this, that he'd been thinking about their future together, made her heart swell. He stood, pulling her up with him, and kissed her. It was their first real kiss, and it was everything Georgia had imagined and more. Sweet and tender and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Gabriel rested his forehead against hers. "I can't believe you said yes. I was so nervous you'd say it was too soon or that you needed more time." "I've already wasted enough time being scared of needing someone," Georgia said. "I'm not wasting any more. I know what I want, and it's you. It's this. It's building a life together." They decided on a spring wedding, giving them time to prepare and to let Gabriel's sister travel from Texas to attend. Georgia wrote to her few remaining relatives back in Missouri, more as a courtesy than because she expected them to come. To her surprise, her cousin Emma wrote back saying she and her husband would make the journey. Emma had always been kind to Georgia, even when others in the family had been critical. The winter months passed in a blur of planning and preparation. Georgia and Gabriel continued to work both properties, but now they also worked on combining their households. They decided to live in Gabriel's house initially, since it was larger, but to keep Georgia's house maintained for potential future use. They talked about expanding, about eventually buying more land and growing their operation into something really significant. Sarah, Georgia's friend from town, helped with wedding preparations. She was thrilled that Georgia had found happiness, and she threw herself into helping plan the ceremony and the celebration afterward. The whole town seemed excited about the wedding. Georgia and Gabriel had become well-liked figures in Prescott, known for their hard work and their willingness to help neighbors in need. Winter also brought challenges. There was a bad snowstorm in January that trapped them both at Gabriel's house for 3 days. Rather than being difficult, those days became some of Georgia's favorite memories. They were snowed in with nowhere to go and nothing to do but be together. They talked for hours, played cards, cooked meals together, and made plans for their future. Gabriel taught her a song his mother used to sing, and Georgia shared stories about her own mother that she'd never told anyone. When the snow finally cleared and they could get back to work, Georgia felt even more certain about her decision to marry Gabriel. She'd seen what it would be like to share her life with him day in and day out, and she wanted more of it. February brought Gabriel's sister, Margaret, and her family. Margaret was a whirlwind of energy, warm and welcoming to Georgia from the moment they met. Her husband, John, was quiet but friendly, and their 2 children, ages 5 and 7, were delightful. They stayed in Georgia's empty house, and the week of their visit was filled with laughter and activity. Margaret pulled Georgia aside one evening and said, "I want you to know how happy I am that Gabriel found you. After our father died, Gabriel threw himself into work, into this dream of owning his own ranch. I was worried he'd forgotten to leave room in his life for anything else. But you've changed that. He talks about you like you hung the moon, and I can see why." "He's changed my life too," Georgia admitted. "I didn't think I needed anyone, but Gabriel showed me the difference between needing someone and choosing to share your life with them." "That's the secret, isn't it?" Margaret smiled. "The best partnerships are between 2 people who could each make it on their own but choose to be together because life is better that way." The wedding took place on a beautiful April morning in 1879. The ceremony was held at the small church in Prescott, with what felt like half the town in attendance. Georgia wore a dress she and Sarah had worked on together, simple but elegant in cream-colored silk. Gabriel wore a new suit, and Georgia thought she'd never seen him look more handsome. As Georgia walked down the aisle, there was no one to give her away. She'd thought briefly about asking one of the local ranchers who'd been kind to her over the years, but in the end, she decided to walk alone. She'd come to Arizona territory alone, built her life alone, and she would come to this marriage as her own person. Gabriel understood and respected that. The ceremony itself was short but meaningful. They'd written their own vows, and when it was Georgia's turn to speak, she looked into Gabriel's eyes and said, "Gabriel Norton, you came into my life when I thought I had everything figured out. You showed me that strength isn't about doing everything alone. It's about knowing when to stand on your own and when to stand beside someone. You've been my friend, my partner, and now you'll be my husband. I promise to love you, to work beside you, to support your dreams while pursuing my own, and to build a life with you that honors both of us." Gabriel's voice was thick with emotion when he delivered his vows. "Georgia Mitchell, from the moment I heard about you, I was drawn to your spirit. Meeting you in person only deepened that admiration. You've taught me what true partnership looks like. You've made me better without ever asking me to be anything but myself. I promise to love you fiercely, to respect your independence, to be your partner in all things, and to spend every day grateful that you chose me." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Gabriel kissed Georgia to enthusiastic applause from the congregation. As they walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, Georgia felt a joy so complete it almost frightened her. She'd never imagined feeling this happy, this settled, this hopeful about the future. The reception was held at the town hall, with food and music and dancing that lasted well into the evening. Georgia danced with Gabriel, with his brother-in-law John, with several of the local ranchers and townspeople. She laughed more than she had in years, surrounded by people who'd become her community. Late in the evening, as the party was winding down, Emma, Georgia's cousin, approached her. "I owe you an apology," Emma said. "When you left Missouri, I thought you were making a mistake. I thought you'd be back within a year, broke and defeated. I didn't understand what you were trying to do, but seeing you now, seeing what you've built and the life you've made, I understand. You needed to prove to yourself what you were capable of, and you did that before you ever met Gabriel. He didn't rescue you, he just joined you on the journey." "Thank you," Georgia said, hugging her cousin. "That means more than you know." Georgia and Gabriel spent their wedding night at Gabriel's house, which was now officially their house. They'd sent everyone else away, craving privacy after the bustle of the day. As they stood together on the porch, looking out at the land that was now fully theirs together, Gabriel wrapped his arms around Georgia from behind. "Happy?" he asked, his voice warm against her ear. "Incredibly," Georgia said, leaning back against him. "Though if someone had told me a year ago that I'd be married and happy about it, I'd have laughed them out of town." "What changed?" Gabriel asked, though she suspected he knew. "You changed everything," Georgia said simply. "You showed me that love doesn't have to mean losing yourself. That partnership can make you stronger, not weaker." She turned in his arms to face him. "Thank you for being patient with me, for waiting while I figured all that out." "You were worth waiting for," Gabriel said, then kissed her softly. "You'll always be worth it." They went inside together, closing the door on the first day of their married life and opening the door to their future. The first year of marriage brought adjustments, as any first year does, but also incredible joy. Georgia and Gabriel worked to truly combine their operations, making decisions together about where to invest, what animals to buy, how to expand. They had disagreements occasionally, both being strong-willed people, but they learned to talk through problems rather than letting resentment build. By summer, they'd expanded their cattle herd significantly, and Georgia's horse training business was thriving. They hired 2 ranch hands to help with the increased workload, 2 young men from town who were hardworking and reliable. This freed up time for Georgia and Gabriel to focus on the bigger picture of their operation. It was in August, during a particularly hot afternoon, that Georgia realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but had waited to be sure before saying anything. When she finally told Gabriel, he picked her up and spun her around, whooping with joy. "We're going to be parents," he said, setting her down carefully, suddenly worried about being too rough. "We're going to have a baby." "We are," Georgia confirmed, laughing at his mixture of excitement and anxiety. "In about 6 months, if I'm calculating right." Gabriel immediately became protective, wanting Georgia to rest more and do less physical labor. Georgia had to firmly remind him that she was pregnant, not fragile, and that she had no intention of spending 6 months sitting around. They compromised, with Georgia agreeing to be more careful and Gabriel agreeing not to treat her like she was made of glass. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Georgia continued to work, though she did scale back on some of the more strenuous activities as she got bigger. The town women, who'd initially been skeptical of Georgia when she'd first arrived, rallied around her now, offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and support. Sarah organized a gathering to celebrate the coming baby, and Georgia was touched by the outpouring of affection from the community. Margaret wrote regularly from Texas, offering her own advice and promising to visit after the baby was born. The connection between the families grew stronger, with Margaret already planning for her children to visit their new cousin. In February of 1880, During a cold snap that had everyone huddled near their fires, Georgia went into labor. It was a long labor, nearly a full day, and there were moments when both Georgia and Gabriel were scared. But the midwife who'd come from town, an experienced woman named Mrs. Chen, remained calm throughout, and finally, just after dawn, their son was born. They named him Grant Henry Norton. Grant for the strength they hoped he'd have, and Henry after Georgia's father, despite everything. Gabriel held his son with such tenderness that Georgia felt tears stream down her face. This tough cowboy who could rope a steer and work from sunup to sundown without complaint was completely undone by the tiny infant in his arms. "He's perfect," Gabriel whispered, his own eyes wet. "Georgia, look what we made. He's absolutely perfect." Georgia reached out to touch her son's tiny hand, and Grant's fingers wrapped around hers instinctively. In that moment, she felt a love so fierce and protective it was almost frightening. This child, this perfect combination of her and Gabriel, would grow up in a world where his parents worked side by side, where partnership and respect were the foundation of the home. He'd grow up knowing his mother was strong and capable, and his father was loving and supportive. The first weeks with a newborn were exhausting but wonderful. Gabriel was an involved father from the start, taking night shifts with Grant so Georgia could rest, learning to change diapers and soothe a crying baby with the same dedication he brought to everything else. The ranch hands stepped up too, taking on extra work so Gabriel and Georgia could focus on their new family. As winter turned to spring, they settled into a new routine. Georgia would work with Grant in a sling tied to her body, and as he got older, they set up a safe area in the barn where he could play while they worked nearby. It wasn't always easy, balancing parenthood with running a ranch, but they made it work. One evening in May, when Grant was about 3 months old, Georgia and Gabriel sat on their porch watching the sunset while Grant slept in Georgia's arms. The land around them was green from spring rains, and their combined herds dotted the landscape. "Do you remember when you asked me if I ever got lonely?" Georgia asked, thinking back to that evening on Gabriel's porch nearly 2 years ago. "I remember," Gabriel said. "I couldn't have imagined then that my life would look like this. That I'd be married, have a child, be running a successful ranch with a partner who respects me completely." Georgia looked at Gabriel, then down at their sleeping son. "You know what the funny thing is?" "What's that?" "I'm more independent now than I ever was when I was alone. Because I'm not spending all my energy just surviving. With you beside me, I have the freedom to actually thrive, to dream bigger, to take risks I never could have taken on my own." Georgia smiled. "That's not what I expected love to feel like." Gabriel reached over and took her hand. "What did you expect?" "I thought love would feel like giving up parts of myself, like compromise always meant loss." Georgia intertwined her fingers with his. "But this feels like becoming more fully myself, not less. Like I can be strong and vulnerable, independent and partnered, all at the same time." "That's because we built this right," Gabriel said. "We started as equals and we've stayed equals. Every decision we make together. Every success we have, we share. That's the kind of love that makes you bigger, not smaller." Grant stirred in Georgia's arms, making the small sounds that meant he'd wake soon, hungry and demanding attention. Georgia looked at her husband, her son, her land, and felt a contentment that went bone deep. Over the next few years, their ranch grew and prospered. They bought additional land, expanding their operation significantly. Georgia's reputation as a horse trainer spread beyond Prescott, and people came from across the territory to buy horses she trained. Gabriel's cattle business thrived, and he became known for raising quality stock. In 1882, They had their second child, a daughter they named Grace Marie Norton. Grace was completely different from Grant. Where he'd been a relatively easy baby, she was colicky and demanding, keeping them up half the night. But she also had Georgia's determination and Gabriel's charm, and both parents were completely smitten with her. Grant, now 2.5, was fascinated by his baby sister. He wanted to help with everything, from feeding to changing diapers. Gabriel taught him to be gentle, and Georgia marveled at how sweet her son was with his little sister. Life was busy with 2 young children and a growing ranch operation. Some days were overwhelming, and there were moments when Georgia wondered how they'd manage it all. But she and Gabriel worked as a team, supporting each other through the challenges and celebrating the victories together. In 1884, they hired a governess to help educate Grant and eventually Grace. Education was important to both Georgia and Gabriel, and they wanted their children to have opportunities they'd never had. Miss Patterson was a young woman from Boston who'd come west seeking adventure, and she proved to be an excellent teacher and a good addition to their household. As the years passed, Prescott grew and changed. The railroad came through, making it easier to ship cattle and goods. The town got its first bank, a proper school building, and even a small theater. Georgia and Gabriel became respected members of the community, known for their fairness, their hard work, and their willingness to help neighbors in need. In 1886, Gabriel surprised Georgia with a gift. He'd commissioned a sign for their ranch, a beautiful carved piece of wood that read Norton Ranch, EST. 1878, with both their names listed as proprietors. He hung it at the entrance to their property, a permanent declaration that this was their shared achievement. "I wanted everyone to know that this place belongs to both of us," Gabriel said as they stood looking at the sign. "That we built it together." Georgia couldn't speak for a moment, too moved by the gesture. Even after 8 years of marriage, Gabriel still found ways to show her that he valued her partnership, that he saw her as his equal in all things. Their children grew. Grant became an excellent horseman, often riding out with his father to check on the cattle or help with ranch work. He had Georgia's practicality and Gabriel's easy way with people. Grace was more bookish, preferring to spend time with Miss Patterson learning about history and literature, though she could also rope a calf or mend a fence when needed. She had her father's charm and her mother's stubborn streak, a combination that both delighted and occasionally exasperated her parents. In 1888, when Grant was 8 and Grace was 6, Georgia found herself pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the first 2, and at 33 she felt every ache and pain more acutely. Gabriel hovered, worried, but Georgia was determined to see it through. Their third child, a boy they named Gerald Thomas Norton, was born in early 1889. The birth was difficult, and the doctor warned Georgia that having more children might be dangerous. Georgia and Gabriel decided that 3 children was plenty, that they had everything they needed. Gerald was a happy baby, easier than Grace had been but more active than Grant. He kept Georgia and Gabriel on their toes, getting into everything and showing early signs of his father's adventurous nature. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch continued to prosper, providing a good living for their family and the people they employed. Grant, as he got older, showed real aptitude for the business side of ranching, often sitting with Gabriel to go over accounts and make plans. Grace discovered a talent for training the dogs they kept for herding, developing methods that were impressively effective. Gerald was still young, but he showed promise in everything he tried. In 1892, Margaret and her family made another visit from Texas. Her children were now teenagers, confident and capable, and they fit right in with their Arizona cousins. The two families spent 2 wonderful weeks together, with the cousins becoming close friends despite the distance between them. One evening during this visit, Margaret and Georgia sat on the porch while the men supervised the children in a game that involved a lot of running and laughter. "You know, I never thanked you properly," Margaret said. "For what?" Georgia was puzzled. "For loving my brother the way you do, for building this life with him." Margaret gestured at the scene before them. The children playing, Gabriel laughing as Gerald tried to climb on his back, the ranch spread out around them. "When we were young, after our mother died, Gabriel took on so much responsibility. He helped raise me while our father was working. He sacrificed his own childhood in a lot of ways. I always worried he'd never let himself have his own happiness, that he'd never feel like he deserved it." "Gabriel deserves all the happiness in the world," Georgia said firmly. "He's the best man I've ever known." "He'd say the same about you," Margaret said with a smile. "That's why this works so well. You both think you got the better end of the deal." After Margaret's family returned to Texas, life continued its steady pace. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and Georgia and Gabriel's love deepened with each passing year. They had their challenges, as any family does. There were years when drought made things difficult, or when cattle prices dropped and they had to tighten their belts. There were the normal struggles of raising children, the worries about illness or accidents, the everyday trials of life. But through it all, Georgia and Gabriel faced everything together. They'd built their relationship on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine partnership, and that foundation held firm through good times and bad. In 1895, Grant turned 15 and announced he wanted to be a full partner in the ranch. Gabriel and Georgia discussed it seriously, deciding to give him increasing responsibility while still making sure he finished his education with Miss Patterson. Grant rose to the challenge, showing maturity beyond his years. Grace, at 13, declared she wanted to breed and train horses professionally. Georgia couldn't have been more proud. She began teaching Grace everything she knew, and they spent hours together working with the horses. Grace had inherited her mother's gift for understanding animals, and she quickly became skilled at the work. Gerald, now 6, was still figuring out what interested him most. He loved everything about ranch life, but he also showed artistic talent, often drawing the landscapes and animals around him. Georgia and Gabriel encouraged all his interests, wanting him to have the freedom to discover his own path. As the century drew to a close, Georgia sometimes found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. She thought about the scared but determined young woman who'd arrived in Arizona territory with barely enough money to buy land. She thought about the lonely years of struggle, the pride she'd taken in her independence, and the walls she'd built around her heart. And she thought about Gabriel riding onto that neighboring property, about learning that his arrival hadn't been coincidence but choice. About how angry she'd been at first, and then how that anger had transformed into understanding and eventually into love. On a cool evening in December of 1899, as the old century prepared to give way to the new, Georgia and Gabriel sat together on their porch as they'd done countless times before. Their children were inside, the older two helping Gerald with a drawing project. The ranch was quiet, peaceful, successful beyond what Georgia had dared to dream when she'd first arrived. "You ever regret it?" Gabriel asked suddenly. "Marrying me, I mean, giving up some of your independence." Georgia looked at him in surprise. "Where is this coming from?" "I was thinking about when we first met, how fierce you were about doing everything yourself, how you didn't need anyone." Gabriel's expression was thoughtful. "I worry sometimes that I pushed my way into your life, that you might have been happier staying independent. Gabriel Norton, look at me. Georgia waited until he met her eyes. I didn't give up my independence when I married you. I expanded it. Yes, I can do things alone. I proved that to myself and to everyone else. But I don't want to do things alone. I want to do them with you, beside you, as your equal partner. That's not weakness or dependence. That's choice. That's love. I love you, Gabriel said, as he'd said countless times over their years together. But it never got old, never lost its power to make Georgia's heart flutter. I love you too, Georgia replied. Thank you for buying that land next to mine. Thank you for being patient while I figured out that letting you in didn't mean losing myself. Thank you for every day we've had together. Thank you for saying yes, Gabriel said, pulling her close. That day I proposed, I was so nervous you'd turn me down. I almost did, Georgia admitted. Not because I didn't love you, but because I was scared. Scared of needing someone, of what might happen if I lost you. But I realized that the risk was worth it, that a life lived afraid of loss isn't really living at all. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars come out. From inside, they could hear their children's voices, arguing good-naturedly about something. The sounds of the ranch settling for the night surrounded them, familiar and comforting. You think we did it right? Gabriel asked. Raising the kids, running the ranch, building this life. I think we did our best, Georgia said, and our best turned out pretty well. Grant's going to be an excellent rancher. Grace has real talent with horses. Gerald's still finding his way, but he will. They're good kids, Gabriel, strong and kind and capable. We should be proud. I am proud of them and of you and of what we've built together. Gabriel kissed the top of her head. Here's to the next century. May it bring us as much joy as this one has. As they headed inside to join their children, Georgia paused at the door to look back at the land spread out before them. This place, these people, this life. It was everything she'd never known she wanted. And it had all started with a cowboy buying the land next to hers, with what she'd thought was coincidence but was really the beginning of the greatest adventure of her life. The years continued to roll by, bringing new challenges and new joys. Grant married at 22, bringing home a smart, capable woman named Alice who fit right into the family. They built a house on the far edge of the ranch property and began raising their own family, eventually giving Georgia and Gabriel 4 grandchildren. Grace went into business for herself, breeding and training horses. Her reputation grew, and she never married, choosing instead to focus on her work. Georgia understood completely, seeing in her daughter the same fierce independence she'd once felt. Grace was happy, successful, and that was all that mattered. Gerald surprised everyone by going to college, studying art, and eventually becoming a respected painter. He moved to San Francisco but visited often, and his paintings of ranch life and Arizona landscapes became sought after. He married a fellow artist, and they had twin boys who loved visiting their grandparents' ranch. Gabriel and Georgia gradually handed over more responsibility to Grant and his family, though they never fully retired. They were in their 50s now, still strong and active, but happy to let the younger generation take the lead. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1904, their entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Children and grandchildren filled the house, along with friends from town and neighboring ranchers. Margaret made the trip from Texas, older now but still full of energy. There was food and music and dancing and speeches that made both Georgia and Gabriel tear up. When it was Georgia's turn to speak, she looked around at all the faces gathered there, at the life she and Gabriel had built together. 25 years ago, I married the man who changed my life, she began. I was so sure I had everything figured out that I knew what I needed to be happy. Gabriel showed me I was wrong. He showed me that happiness wasn't about proving I could do everything alone. It was about choosing to share my life with someone who valued me, respected me, and loved me exactly as I was. Together, we built this ranch, raised our children, and created a life richer than anything I could have achieved alone. Gabriel, thank you for buying that land next to mine. Thank you for being patient with me. Thank you for 25 years of partnership, love, and adventure. Here's to 25 more. The room erupted in applause and cheers. Gabriel stood and pulled Georgia into his arms, kissing her thoroughly while their grandchildren giggled and their children smiled. Late that night, after everyone else had gone to bed or home, Georgia and Gabriel walked out to the fence line that had once separated their properties. The fence was gone now, had been for years, but they could still remember exactly where it had stood. "Do you remember the first time I rode up to you?" Gabriel asked. "You were hauling timber, and you looked so suspicious when you saw me. I thought you were just another man who was going to underestimate me or try to take advantage," Georgia said. "I never imagined you'd end up being the love of my life. Best decision I ever made buying this land," Gabriel said. "Well, second best. The best was asking you to marry me. And me saying yes," Georgia added with a smile. "Don't forget that part." They stood together in the darkness, looking out at the ranch that bore both their names, the land they'd worked and loved and built upon. In the distance, they could see lights from Grant's house, where another generation was building their own dreams. Closer by, Grace's barn was dark and quiet. Gerald's old room in the main house was now a studio where he stayed when he visited, the walls covered with paintings of his family and the place he'd always call home. Georgia leaned into Gabriel, feeling his arm come around her automatically, as natural as breathing. After 25 years, they moved together instinctively, two people who'd become one partnership while remaining fully themselves. "I'd do it all again," Georgia said quietly. "Every struggle, every challenge, every moment. I'd do it all again to end up right here, right now with you." "Me too," Gabriel said. "Though maybe next time you could be a little less stubborn about accepting help." Georgia laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet land. "Not a chance. You fell in love with a stubborn woman. You're stuck with her now." "Wouldn't have it any other way," Gabriel said, and kissed her once more under the vast Arizona sky. They stood there for a while longer, two people who'd found each other against the odds, who'd built a life together that honored both their strengths. As they finally turned to head back to the house, Georgia sent up a silent thank you to whatever fate or fortune had brought Gabriel Norton to the property next to hers all those years ago. She'd thought it was coincidence, just the random working of chance. But looking back now, with the wisdom of years and the clarity of hindsight, Georgia knew better. Whether Gabriel had sought her out or whether destiny had brought them together, the result was the same. They'd found each other, built a life together, and created something lasting and beautiful. And really, Georgia thought as they walked hand in hand toward the warm lights of home, that was all that mattered in the end. Not how they'd begun, but what they'd built together. Not the independence she'd once guarded so fiercely, but the partnership that had made both their lives infinitely richer. The cowboy who'd bought the land next to hers had become her husband, her partner, the father of her children, and the love of her life. And every day, from that first proposal to this moment, 25 years later and all the years still to come, she was grateful she'd said yes. Inside the house, their family waited, warm and loud and full of life. Georgia and Gabriel walked through the door together, stepping into the light and love they'd spent a quarter-century building, ready for whatever adventures the next 25 years would bring. Together, as they'd always been, as they'd always be, for as long as their story continued. And what a story it was.